These banks have been levered up on cheap money. They are going to be the primary losers in a financial crisis, just like they were in 2008, because they are the creditors. They were gorging on all this cheap money. They were extending all this bad credit. And when interest rates are near zero, these bad loans can survive. But as the Fed is raising interest rates, a lot of these loans were going to go into default. There were going to be major bankruptcies and foreclosures, and we were going to have a worse financial crisis than 2008. 2008 was all about too much debt and the inability to pay. Well, we've got a lot more debt now, and we're even less able to pay. The only thing that kept it going was the artificially low interest rates. And in fact, even Janet Yellen herself, who was a lousy Fed chairman, and she's an even worse Secretary of the Treasury, but about a year ago, Janet Yellen was asked a question about the size of the debt and the big increase in the national debt because of COVID. And Janet Yellen said, well, don't worry about the national debt. Doesn't matter. Look how low interest rates are. Just focus on the servicing costs of the debt. Doesn't matter how much debt we have. Look, it's hardly costing us anything to pay the interest. Well, look at it now. Interest rates, short-term rates have gone from basically nothing to 4%. And they're headed from 4% to 8%. The cost of financing the national debt has already increased by a factor of 16. If you figure from 25 basis points to 400 basis points, that's a 16-fold increase. So if the debt wasn't a problem because it was so cheap to finance it, well, it's a huge problem now when the cost is 16 times higher. And as all this debt starts to mature, it has to roll over at these higher prices. Look, we are very close to another financial crisis. And I think what happened in the UK, and now all of a sudden, looking at what's happening in Credit Suisse and other banks, people are starting to actually question the insanity of the narrative that they all believed in, that the Fed could actually raise interest rates to 4 or 5%, and that all hell wasn't going to break loose. I mean, remember, what happened in 2018? The Fed got to 2.5%, and everything started to collapse. We had the biggest drop in the stock market in the fourth quarter since the Great Depression, the worst December since the Great Depression. And the Fed had to call off quantitative easing back then. And the balance sheet was only $4 trillion. It's now closer to $9 trillion. Think about all the debt that we've taken on since 2018. If the Fed really couldn't get interest rates above 2.5% back then, it's already got them above that now. And so we really would be imploding. And so what I think is going on is the markets are finally just questioning this. They still haven't really figured it out. They still haven't figured out the rock and the hard place that the Fed and the country are between. Because the Fed is going to have to pivot, but inflation is going to run out of control. See, they've got to make a choice. Do they want inflation or do they want economic implosion? Now, ultimately, if they choose inflation, we're going to have an implosion anyway because we're going to have hyperinflation. It just may happen a year later. Well, that's good enough for the politicians. All they care about is that it doesn't happen now. Because to fight inflation, and there's only one way they're going to fight inflation successfully, which is why they can't do it. They've got to raise interest rates above the rate of inflation. And inflation is what, 8%? Even if it's 6%, they got to get short-term interest rates up to 7%. They're barely at 4%. They got a long way to go. And they've got to have massive cuts to government spending. They're not even considering that. Because right now, the way the government pays for spending is with inflation. Inflation is the stealth tax by which the government pays for everything. In fact, going all the way back to the TARP bailouts, Obamacare, the PPP, how did we get all this government? We didn't get it for free. We paid for it with inflation. They created money to pay for all this stuff. Now, if the government wants to get rid of inflation, they have to get rid of that money. And so they have to run budget surpluses. The Federal Reserve has to be able to withdraw all the liquidity that it's supplied. So we have to have big cuts to government spending. Right now, the government's got to cut Social Security, Medicare, Obamacare, national defense. We have to shrink the amount of money the government is spending. The government has to spend less money next year than it spent last year. In real terms, actual cuts, not reductions in the rate of increases, but actual cuts. That's not happening. So the government's got to choose. Do we want to have a financial crisis and cut government spending and allow bankruptcies and defaults and all these losses, or do we want to have inflation? And that's what they're going to pick. Sure, if they thought they can get rid of inflation without a problem, yes. The public doesn't like inflation, so the politicians wanted to talk tough about inflation. But what they're going to like even less than inflation is when they lose everything they've got, when they have a complete economic implosion, when their savings and investment accounts get wiped out and they lose their jobs. They're not going to like that. Now, of course, that's going to happen eventually anyway. There's no free lunch here. If the government chooses inflation, then inflation is going to wipe everybody out. So everybody's going to get wiped out through deflation when this whole thing collapses and a crisis, or they're going to get wiped out through inflation. But the reason the Fed is going to pick inflation is because that happens later. And of course, as we've seen, they can come up with a scapegoat to blame inflation on somebody else. They never accept responsibility for the inflation they create. So if the Fed keeps hiking rates and everything implodes, well, hey, we did that to ourselves. If prices just run out of control, well, we could blame OPEC. After all, they just cut production for oil. We could blame Putin. We could blame greedy corporations. We could blame capitalism, speculators. I mean, maybe they'll even try to blame me. Who knows?